I'm in cyber, specifically cybersecurity. On a daily basis, I audit information, perform incident response, and take requests from people walking into my door for information. Now, while I'm trying to keep my sanity, as I run around like a metaphorical chicken runs around like its head's cut off, I try to find better ways to do things, such as gathering data, which PowerShell is very helpful in my position. Sometimes I just query individual pieces of information. Sometimes I configure large amounts. So individual pieces, somebody wants to know if a piece of software is installed on a machine that shouldn't be, well then I'll run a query based on that. Or, such as like with the reimage process, or just in general to see the compliance footprint, I'll look for a bunch of information related to machines and their image setup, such as settings related to BIOS, like TPM, credential guard, security settings that are affected by the BIOS, like settings like secure boot, UEFI, stuff like that. Basic device driver information, just so I can see if they even perform the basics with configuration. Look at the hard drive, making sure it's got enough space. Going back to the basics, just making sure simple things don't snowball into bigger issues down the line. So now with PowerShell, you can query a lot of information. The issue is when you're trying to query varying information, it's tough to try to keep it organized. It doesn't exactly play well together without PowerShell's design, so you have to kind of force it. Like all these commands, you try to run all this stuff together to try to get some information, and it's going to be kind of a mess and a little bit jumbled. When you're doing a bunch of remote machines, you give it a list of assets, and it's going to randomly return information based on the time that it ran per machine. Machine performance can affect how it's returned, so it's not going to return organized. A better way is to return it in some sort of table format, and even more so into a spreadsheet. That way you can sort it, such as by computer name. So you can query a bunch of varying pieces of information. The other part of it is formatting it so it actually turns out in a way that actually makes sense. So like this, trying to just query a bunch of random information, it's not necessarily going to tell you anything. Like trying to look at stuff in a subdirectory, even specifying it, it doesn't always come out the way you want it to, such as trying to find how many objects are in a folder path. I mean, I just did a user profile, but you might want to kind of look at the norm, like an installed program. We had an issue with a piece of software that some of the installs were bad. Well, one of the ways I was able to figure out is by the amount of objects that were in a directory of an installation. So I could pretty much pinpoint the ones that were bad just by that. So you can narrow it down to specific pieces of information, which makes it a little easier to work with, such as just the count of logged on users instead of all the logged on users. Just one piece of information in a WMI class, or a few specific pieces, or just a specific property or value of some sort of piece of data. So you run this, organizes it a little better, so it's easier to work with, but still not quite ideal, because the same problem is going to occur. So that's where we go to now, and as you can see, trying to run this remotely. Using my host, like I'm running it remotely, you'll run into the same issues. So, or the issues that I mentioned, where if you're querying a bunch of machines, it's going to come back randomly, so you're not going to be able to know specifically by this which machine piece of information came from. So, except for certain properties come back with a PS computer name field. In this case, it reflects how I put it in there, but some things will come back and actually give you information, such as the host name, right off the bat. So that's where we go to making tables. So there are different ways to make tables of information in PowerShell. Some are more confusing or more complicated than others. There are more classic ones. There's hash tables. Some people like those. I prefer to stick to PowerShell. Keep it as close to looking like PowerShell, basic PowerShell commands as possible, because it's easier to understand. And that way I can once again share this out to people. So you can do it by basically making a new variable or array, and then you basically create a new variable, a new table that you can populate with information. So, and once you've created that variable, you add the information you want, pick the properties you want, and then you can either choose to return it, or you can, depending on how you're running it, you can just have it stored in there, and then you can choose to return it or export it at a later time. So you run this, and it actually puts it in a table format, even information, although that didn't come out like I wanted it to. So we'll call that as a little bit of a fail there. Name. That should come out better this time. There we go. So, whoopsie. So there you go. So varying information looks in a table format. You can add more complication to it, like right here. You can add a whole crap load of information in it. And you can format it however you want. Format table. That's what that acronym is for. Then run that. So you'll see. Now it doesn't quite stay on the screen because there's limitations by default. Now the other part you got to look at is efficiency. Now my table version may not be the most efficient, but for me, I don't have a lot of time to troubleshoot, so it gets the job done. So, but there are ways to make your tables, your queries more efficient. I don't know which is the most efficient way, whether you're doing something with just basic PowerShell, hash tables, going into like other scripting languages. I mean, I haven't gotten into that, but I also don't really have time with the tempo of my work. So I stick to the basics. That way I don't have to spend much time troubleshooting, and I can pretty much use this type of table and change the information out as needed. So one way you can make this more efficient, well, if you look at this, I have multiple lines that are pretty much querying the same WMI class, and it's rerunning the same command over and over. Well, querying WMI tempo generally isn't very efficient. So it's better to make it do one command and then just pull the information you want. So in this case, it's pulling from the same class all these information, or you can even just pick one, but either way, it's the amount of time it takes to query that class, where you can actually change it to doing it just once, down to just have a command up top, make a variable or array for that information, and you can populate it with all those items, and then all I have to do is call that array and pull out the specific piece of information. Now it may not seem like much, but when you start adding the amount of machines you're doing, the total amount of time it takes to run these commands can increase by a long shot. So one machine, now I've ran this before, you go to new tabs just so we know that there's no previous data that is influencing it. Now the original one where it's requerying the same thing twice, we'll run it here, paste that in there, and while we're waiting for that, we'll do that one. Control C, go here, paste that. So I'm querying one machine. Now, it's really not taking that long. So it took 2 seconds on both of them. Now, milliseconds wise, there was almost a second difference when it's actually measured down. So, I mean, if you look at that with one machine for all this information, I mean, you might almost shave off a second just by changing how your command runs a little bit. Now, add more pieces of information that you're querying, that can jump up, and then when you're querying 1,000 machines, all of a sudden you start having time saving based on how you're formatting. So, looking down even further, you can show doing a remote machine, and then we'll go even a step further to seeing how long it takes to query it on a remote machine. As my machine, you'll start to see the difference. And this one I kind of mixed it up, but this is the one where I combine the one command and then just pull data from it, and then we'll look at back at the other one where it does the same command multiple times and is less efficient. We'll run that on this one. You'll see the difference here. So the more efficient one did it in 19 seconds. And we'll just see here in a minute. So essentially you can see this is a way you can pull information. And I didn't actually grab the right one. Fail. Okay, there we go. So we'll run that there. Okay, so we have 19 seconds here for the more efficient version of the command, and this one's a less efficient version. Now lastly, we'll just go to the very last one. You can also export this to a CSV file, which makes this a lot easier. So you can do export.csv. You can also do fancy commands, env user profile. You can put this, makes it a little easier. We'll just do it in desktop. All right. Let's do a basic export. Oops. Script is missing a terminator. One thing to note, it helps to change the font of your PowerShell window to see some things like this, because it can actually be hard to see these little symbol things that I'm having a brain fart on. So there. Export. Oh, fail. Because it's too early in the morning. I'll export that. So now, okay, so I ran these scripts. The less efficient one took 21 seconds, and the other one took 19 seconds. So when you're remotely trying to assess information, well, you can find that the efficiency can vary. So we'll go to look at the CSV file, and lastly, pull it over here, and we'll open it up. And here we go. Here's all that information in a table format with some extra things that you can play around with, that you don't want. And you can add more properties, and this is just the default, pretty much, how something will turn out. So that's how you can make tables of information to make your job a little bit simpler.